Now, welcome, Sanne. Very great to have you. We're going to talk about the imposter syndrome, especially in academia today. And you are doing research on that topic. So I thought, who else to ask than Sanne? Please give us a little bit, tell us a little bit about yourself.
So my name is Sanne Feenstra and I'm an assistant professor at UD at Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, where we are right now.
Yeah.
I did my PhD in Groningen, at the University of Groningen. Before that also studied in Groningen, psychology. And in my PhD I examined power and leadership, kind of at the business faculty. So I examined how power affects the behaviors and thoughts and feelings of leaders. And after my PhD, I moved here to Amsterdam, to the Vrije Universiteit. And I'm still very much interested in doing research on power and leadership and those kind of topics. And as you said, also specifically looking at gender, power, leadership, and the imposter phenomenon in that regard.
Yeah, and you already mentioned a very curious thing. We talked about it already when we just had a coffee ourselves. But you call it the imposter phenomenon.
Sure.
And I think that has to do with your vision on imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
Can you tell a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually the imposter phenomenon, as I refer to it, a lot of people know it. It's widely known as the imposter syndrome. But actually what I think is very interesting, that in the 70s, when it was first described, this was actually described as the imposter phenomenon. So this was in the 1970s, and clinical psychologists for the first time described these feelings of, well, maybe I should explain first a little bit more about what that is so that everybody has a clear idea. But it is the feeling that you're worried that other people think more highly of you than you think of yourself. Yeah. So you think that others think that you are doing very good, so therefore you are hired, you are promoted, you get a PhD position, right? You're at the university, etc. So all of these good things happen, and people say, well, welcome aboard, and we love to have you here because we think you're very smart and great, and you're like,
I'm not so sure.
Are you sure? Didn't you miss something, right? So people are a bit worried that they might get their positions or their places in university because of luck or because of nepotism even. And therefore they feel kind of like cheaters, or hence the name imposters. And therefore they are kind of worried that they might be found out. So if you feel like an imposter, of course there is often the worry that any moment now they will figure out that they made a mistake of hiring me, or they made a mistake of giving me this promotion, and they will figure out that I'm actually not as capable as they thought I was.
Yeah, so I often hear that people feel like now there are all these expectations, and I cannot live up to those expectations, right?
Yeah, and that is very much at the heart of that feeling. You know, that worry of being found out is, of course, a very negative, hesitant experience, but I guess we will get to that a bit later as well, and its consequences. But this experience was first described as by clinical psychologists in the 70s, and it described actually women in their careers. You know, it was also in the time, of course, that women started working more and developing these careers, first generation of doing so. So they kind of felt like, am I really at place in here? Do I really fit in, etc. So that's when it was first described as the imposter phenomenon. And now we see that over the last 10, 20 years, we see this big rise again in attention toward it and people talking about it, also in a more popular and social media. But now people often refer to it as the imposter syndrome. And I'm not a big fan of that because it kind of suggests that it's kind of maybe a disorder, you know, something is wrong with the individual. You kind of you have a mental disorder, so to say, right? Syndrome kind of suggests as such. Which it's not, right? It's not a clinical condition. It's not in the DSM, right, from where the clinical disorders are listed. So it's not as such. And I think the difficulty with referring to it as a syndrome, and more generally, is that we tend to look at very much the individual when trying to solve these kinds of issues. Yeah. So imposter syndrome kind of, to me, suggests that you look at the individual and you say, well, you are very insecure.
Yeah, so it's your problem.
Your problem, and we need to fix you. So let's give you a training and make you more secure, or give you this and this and this. While I am also very much interested, also as a social psychologist by training, to look more at the context. So what kind of context do you find people in, and why is it maybe very likely that they develop these feelings of imposterism in those situations?
Yeah, and in your, I think I can put down some references as well if you want to read more about it. You did some research on the environmental factors that are actually very, sort of high risk in developing imposter phenomenon.
Yeah, correct.
And can you tell a little bit more about what those factors might be?
Yeah, for sure. So if we look back in the literature, earlier, they looked mostly at individual predictors. So like I said, it started off with this gender, and later on they started examining personality and even a lot of upbringing and attachment styles from early childhood. So that was, of course, also very interesting. And now we are trying to develop a research line in which we look more at the organizational context. So how are you treated by the people at work or at the university? Because indeed, a lot of students also experience these imposter feelings. So what kind of context triggered this? And if we look into the research, one of my master students actually recently did a fantastic master thesis on a project in which he looks at competitiveness of the organizational culture. So if an organization has a very competitive culture, people in general in such an organization tend to feel more like imposters. So I guess it's very much the focus on the outcomes and on the competitions and on what do you bring, are you better than anybody else? So this hyper focus on the outcome really enhances these feelings of imposterism. Well, we are here also talking in the light of PhD students, right, and their mental health. So I guess
but I think it's also, it actually comes... I get more signals, more and more, that also master students, sometimes even bachelor students, are already feeling super stressed out and also having feelings of imposter.
I agree, and I have the exact same experience. I, of course, work a lot with bachelor and master students, and I get a lot of the same experience, that they're very stressed. And indeed also experience these imposter feelings. Although is this, of course, also a bit of a selection bias, because of course they know that I study imposter phenomenon, so people come to me and say, "Oh, I want to study that because I have that." I definitely see that a lot of master students mention these feelings as well, and feeling stressed, and related to that, this worry of being found out. So these competitive cultures very much we see in our research enhances these feelings. Another thing that we have identified that's a very important mechanism, and I guess that's also maybe the mechanism with regards to competitiveness, but we haven't directly tested that yet, is that a very important mechanism for feeling like an imposter is this feeling of feeling like you fit in. So do you feel like you fit in? Do the people around you look like you? Do they act like you, right? So this is not only with regards to your physical appearance, but also personality, or how they dress, or how they behave. Do you know how you're supposed to behave at university, right? And do you know how the systems work? Or do you kind of feel like you're out of place? So this feeling of fitting in is very key to reducing or not enhancing these imposter feelings we see.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and I wonder if people recognize this, and please let me know through a DM on Instagram or a reaction under this podcast. To if you feel like that's maybe where it comes from for me, because I think at the VU they are really trying to get everyone to fit in right now. Right, that's one of the key things from the VU, inclusivity. So I think it's a very important point, and especially regarding imposter phenomenon, apparently.
Sure.
So that's really interesting. We have a lot of international students, of course, and a lot of different cultures, subcultures.
So that just creates an extra challenge to make people fit in, feel like they belong and like they fit in the university in this case. For sure.
And do you have any personal experiences with imposter phenomenon?
Not that much, actually. So for me, like I said, I did my PhD at the University of Groningen. Throughout my PhD, didn't feel many of these imposter feelings. Wasn't very insecure. I mean, it was stressful sometimes in the sense that you had to work very hard, but also I very much liked it to just be focused on one project, and you're in charge of that. So I enjoyed it a lot, my PhD. For me, that was just the one moment where I very much experienced then these imposter feelings. So again, also coming back to this, also the context can shape these feelings of imposterism. For me, the defense, the PhD defense, did was like, there I did very much feel like, you know, you have the whole PhD ready. I did 6 years of research. My PhD took 6 years. So then there's the defense, and of course there's your book and all your research, and then the committee will look at it. And then I did have this worry of, you know, I'm going to be there in front of everybody, and then they're going to, you know, actually read the stuff.
Yeah. And all the flaws and limitations.
And then they're going to say, oh, wait, oh, we didn't notice that. Oh no, yeah. So there I was kind of like all the limitations that you know by heart in your research, right? You know, all the flaws, you know, all the weaknesses, and then you're like, oh no, they're gonna actually see that. So that was the for me. I mean, if the apparently the I mean, but that is so much a context in which that makes a lot of sense to trigger
definitely.
These feelings. It's very visible. It's very open. It's very, you know, assessment based. You know, what did you do, and now we're gonna see how you did.
Yeah.
And of course, I mean, in the Netherlands, it's all kind of symbolic, anyways. So
Yeah.
they will probably never do it, but still somewhere in the back of your head, you're like, oh.
Yeah, and you hear some stories,
It's
right?
true.
You hear
It's
some
true.
stories of opponents who really are a bit like attacking.
Yeah, true.
Yeah. So but
And
pick your opponents wisely. Yeah.
Yeah, I also posted. I saw it on Twitter a couple of weeks back that I don't know whether it was in Groningen or another university, but in the Netherlands, that this PhD student defended her thesis and then didn't get it because of some reason. So then I was like, yeah, that's what I meant. That was So there I did feel it. So that was, but overall not so much.
Yeah. Well, that's good.
Yeah.
That's good. I already did a poll on Instagram with people if they experience imposter syndrome, and I put the option sometimes or don't get me started. And actually, almost everyone was like, don't get me started.
Yeah.
So it's really an important topic to talk about and to fix a bit here and there.
Yeah, to fix a little bit here and there, and of course already, you know, being open about it and discussing it might already help. And I would also invite people to, if you're talking about it and maybe discussing it also in response to this podcast, to also maybe describe, you know, what kind of context, what kind of situations make you feel that way. So kind of compare, you know, maybe it might be nice to see that some people might at the exact same times, right, see similarities in what triggers these imposter feelings, to also kind of make you aware of the context that might trigger these imposter feelings. That might also be helpful for yourself.
Yeah, and do you think it's all environmental, or do you think, because I believe it's more like an interplay between the individual and the environment?
Yeah. No, of course, and of course we are building on this whole line of research that has been done like for 50 years that also looked at all these individual factors, and definitely not saying that they don't matter, you know, of course, and in light of PhDs, there are of course some PhDs who come into the PhD who already have certain personality traits, such as, for instance, neuroticism is related to feeling like an imposter. So that's definitely true. They're more likely to feel like imposters. Definitely. So I'm not saying that's not true. I'm just also want to shine light, because I think the focus has been a little bit on that. And also, if you're looking at solutions for reducing stress or imposter feelings kind of in general, we tend to focus on the individual, which also makes sense, because I guess that's also kind of a pragmatic and practical way to solve things, to give people training and to help them feel better. And I'm not saying don't do it, it's great, but I think it's also very important that organizations and universities in this regard also think about, you know, what kind of context and teams and leaderships and cultures can we create in which people tend to feel less like imposter, especially if we realize that so many people, in this case students, you know, acknowledge and experience these feelings. I think it's important to also think about more structural solutions.
Yeah, and I think that's a very, very key point, but also a very hard one, because this will take time, right? To change the university culture almost. For sure. And and so I think it's also sort of easier and has the quickest impact to to train the individual, let's say.
Yeah, so it's not to say don't do that, right?
No,
Because
of course,
especially also for the PhDs who are doing the PhD right now, I'm saying, well, change the culture. Well, yeah, that's not
Yeah.
going to help them. So
Right,
definitely do that. And I hope maybe, and I hope maybe also just realizing that it's not just you, it's
that
also the
already
context
helps.
in which you find yourself, and we all try to, help change that a little bit and make that a little bit better. But just to realize that it's not just you, and also these kind of focusing on these trainings might kind of enhance these feelings.
Oh yeah.
And especially for people who tend to feel like imposters, they are often people who do very well. So they perform very highly. I mean, that's kind of true, I guess, for all PhDs, because otherwise
you wouldn't be
doing a PhD. So they're all very high achieving individuals, and they're also very perfectionistic.
Yeah.
Right? So they do want to do very well, also in this regard again, right?
Yeah.
So if you do feel stressed, or it also kind of might feel like a personal failure. Well, my response to that would be, okay, but also try to zoom out and see in what kind of context and situations you are, and think about how that also shapes your feelings. Also acknowledging that a lot of your peers apparently go through the same thing.
Yeah, and maybe your supervisors have gone through it as well, or maybe still do.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm all about also humanizing the supervisor, because we often look so up to them, but they've been in the same spot as you were, right? And they've probably also experienced some form of imposter phenomenon, or throughout their career path. So I think it's very normal to feel that way in academia, but it should not be normal. So that's yeah. And do you have any ideas about how we can, make progress in this? Maybe on an individual level, but maybe mostly in the culture and.
I would say mostly on the culture. So I think it's very much important to focus, like I said, on this mechanism to make people feel like they fit in.
Yeah.
So I think that is a very important focus that we all should have, and I think also the trend is going there. Yeah. So I think we're going in the right direction in that sense. Talking about this competition, what we have seen. This is also a bit, I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be like individual competitive. If you work more as a team, if it's more team-based science, you ideally, if it's more team-based science, you have the fitting in part that's kind of settled, and then the competition part is a bit less, right? So this individual competition probably is not ideal in this regard.
And I think it's quite stimulated in now in academia, right? That you work very independently, and so the individualism is also sort of stimulated.
I think that especially the PhD is still very individualistic. At least if I look at my own career, the PhD, I mean, you have your supervisors, but that's a team, you and the supervisors. Right? But of course,
it's also in the dynamics.
But it's of course, supervised and subordinate. That's it. Now that I'm an assistant professor, I have much more team projects. Pretty much all my projects are team projects. Right? I have some with only students, so that's still a little bit that. But most of them are with multiple colleagues. From here at the VU, but also just the people you meet outside at conferences, and it's often also people of course you have a mutual interest in research, but it's often also the people that you're interpersonally just get along with, and then you're like, oh, let's write a paper or do a project on this. So this team-based project later on, for me at least in my career, is now much more than it was during the PhD project.
So team building would be a very good.
Or maybe even teamwork,
Teamwork,
somehow, and of course, a PhD project is your PhD thesis is your own. So I mean, you need to think about how you would arrange that. But it is very individualistic, and comparing individual PhDs. Well, at least for me, after that, it became much more team-based. And if we're looking at our research line on what enhances or reduces imposter feelings, it suggests that these team-based might very much be potential solutions to reducing that.
Yeah, nice. And I was also thinking about when you talk about the competition, that's also, maybe a problem that's even higher up, right? With the funding agencies,
Sure.
for example.
Yeah.
But that's really hard to change. That might be even harder to change. Yeah. But would you have some ideas on how to maybe tweak that a bit?
No, you're absolutely
If it
right.
were up to you.
So you're absolutely right. So one thing, that I noticed during my career is that, it becomes more team-based, but on the other right, actually the competition becomes more fierce because now we're going after the same money.
Yeah, exactly.
That is very tricky. I don't know, I think the thing is to, and at least here at the VU, we recently had a meeting on finances and how finances at the university work, and it was also very much explained and approached as a team effort, right? So if you get in a grant, that's helpful for the whole group. So that at least within the group there is not necessarily competition, because you also want your group members to get money, because that's better for the whole department. So I think this kind of perspective on these issues as well is very important. But then it's also very important that we don't just grant the status to the people who get in the money, but also grant the status to the people who support the person who gets the money, and who helps in doing the teaching, or maybe helps in assisting in other ways in getting these grants. And I think, again, at least here at the VU, I feel like people more and more acknowledge and see that it is very much a team effort. Even the individual grants, as at VVC, I think a lot of people realize that is also a group and a team effort.
And I think that's a very important point, what you're making about acknowledging and rewarding sort of the people also who support or take away other tasks, so that someone can really go for that grant. And the focus is so much on getting the money that it's overshadowing all the other things,
contributions to it.
Yes. So that's a very good point, I think. But the world is all about money. So it's really hard.
The system works that we need to get in money, right? Because otherwise, that's not how
you cannot function.
At least that's part of the system now works.
So, is there anything you would like to get across? Because we're near the end.
So there are a couple of things. First of all, I'm hoping that listeners who maybe think, oh, this is kind of a thing, who recognize themselves in experiencing these feelings. I hope it helps that you know, but kind of more clearly can understand and identify what it is and when you feel it. I think that's very helpful to really pinpoint it, so that you can also see kind of where it comes from. And whether it helps you sometimes. Maybe sometimes it helps, right? So it might also have some positives, but also where it might kind of hurt you. So I think that's helpful. I hope it's helpful that people realize that a lot of people experience these feelings, that it's very common, especially also at universities, among students, among PhD students. So again, I hope that's helpful. And then finally, because people who experience these feelings tend to be so perfectionistic and want to do so well, I want to stress again that I think it's very important to also realize, it's not just your insecurities that make you feel this way, but it's also very much maybe the context in which you find yourself. So also try to identify and see if you're interested, of course. I think it could be helpful to think about, what kind of situations make me feel like imposters, and instead of just focusing on punishing or enhancing yourself.
And I think because it's so common, that already says it's a culture thing, right? So keep that in mind. It's not just you.
Right.
Thank you, Sanne.
You're welcome.
Yes. If you feel like you should talk about imposter syndrome some more, or you feel like you need to get something across to us, always feel free to send me a message. I will just forward it to Sanne.